we're going to take a look at the Mishnah here. The Mishnah here on Daf Mem Zayin. The Mishnah had mentioned that Ha'omer l'chavero, the Mishnah distinguishes between two cases. One case is a konam beischa or sadcha, and in that case, since he mentioned possession, that it's your bias or your sada, therefore, if the owner of the sada dies or he sells it, then the neder is mutter. Okay, because the Isser was only on Beischa and Sadcha. But if on the other hand he said Konim Bayezeh or Sadazu, then the Isser continues forever and ever, even after the death of the owner of the Sada or the Bayes. Boy Avime. Avime raises the following question. Excuse me for just 1 second. Rabbi, I just want to, if you don't mind, I'm going to take one. Again, just to review, in the Mishnah on Daf Mem Vav, which the Gemara is quoting here at the beginning of Daf Mem Zayin, we differentiate between Beischa and Bayzeh. Boy Avimi. Avimi raises the following suffix. Konam l'bayis zeshata nichnas. If a man says to his friend, I own a bias, and I'm imposing upon you a konam, a neder, that you won't enter into the bias. Meis hamadir o mecharo liacher mahu. What happens now is, when he says bias zeh, and he doesn't add any stipulations, he doesn't limit it, Avimi has the following suffix, he vacillates. Would the Madir have the authority, the ability to impact on this bias and create an Isur that would exist and persist even after his death or even after he sells it to someone else? Let's see how Avimi analyzes this suffix. According to one side, in his suffix, Adam oser davar birshusa le sheyetzim. So a person has the authority to create an Isur now on his possession in such a way that that Isur will persist even after he terminates his ownership is terminated. So since at the time that he generated the Isur, it was his chayfetz, which he could asur on somebody else, therefore, even after the bias leaves his rishus, nevertheless, there was an Isur that was chal in the bias vis-a-vis the mudar, lo. Or should we say no? The power and the authority to create an Isur neder is limited in time as long as the bias is his. But once it's no longer in his rishus, the Isur can no longer be chal, because then it's equivalent to taking someone else's property and asserting it on his chaver, which he can't do. Ein adam oser davar she'eino shelo. Here, though, it's not exactly clear that this is ein adam oser davar she'eino shelo, because at the time that he created the Isur, it was his, and the chefza becomes a chefza of neder, of an Isur neder. Omar Rava Toshma. Rava wants to be machriya this suffix of Avimi from a Mishnah back in Bava Kama. At the end of Bava Kama, it says, "Ha'omer livno konam she'iyatoneneli umeis yirashena." If a person, a father, generates an Isur on his ben, then the Isur was only taken as long as he's alive. Once he dies, the father, then the son can inherit it. And he can benefit from the nechasim of his father. Because the father clearly indicated that you shouldn't benefit from me, but now he's not alive anymore. But what would be if he explicitly took a konam and he added the words b'chayav u'b'moso? The father explicitly indicated that he wants this neder to be chal vis-a-vis his son even after his death. Can he do so? Can a person be osed davar b'shuso al ha'osid l'chsheyetze m'shuso? And it says clearly in the Mishnah, in Bava Kama, lo yirashena, the ben cannot inherit his father in this case. His father prohibited these nechasim during his lifetime in such a way that it should be also even after his death. And that Isa will be chal even after his death by virtue of this neder. Shmamino, we see that Adam Oser Davar She Bershuso Le L'Chsheyetze Mershuso. If now it's in his Rishus, he can generate an Isa neder even for the time of after the Rishus, after he dies. Shmamino, we see clearly that a person could ask something in his Rishus even for the period of L'Chsheyetze Mershuso. Okay, now that Rava came to a definite conclusion about a person who says to his friend, Kona bayis zeh, shata nichnas, enjoining his friend from entering into his bayis, and the mudar is not allowed to enter into the bayis even after the madir sells the house or dies, now we're ready for the suffix of Rami Bar Chama. That's a different suffix. And that has to do with what's called chalipe ha'isur. Now, chalipe ha'isur is a concept that's anchored in the laws of Zeroim. When you have a status of a zera and then you plant it, does the chilufim or giduleim, okay, we'll see the difference between the two, carry the same status as the original. So he says the following. Tanan Hasam. We have a Mishnah later on Daf Nun Zayin. A man is standing in front of an entire array of peros, and he declares konam peros ha'elu alai, konam heim alpi, konam heim lifi. These peros are osur ben neder bekonam on me. Or he uses a slightly different language. He says these peros are osur alpi, meaning for me to put into my mouth, or konam heim lifi. Says the Mishnah, Asur b'chilufehem u'begidulehem. Not only did he enjoin himself from the peros, but let's take the case of gidulehem. That's a little bit simpler. If let's say he took these peros and he planted them, then what grows from these peros is also included in his neder. And what's chilufehem? Chilufehem means, let's say, this is a concept that's very high profile in Hegdesh, that let's say you are magdish something, and now you do a pidyon, and you transfer the kedusha from object X to object Y. That's called chilufehem. Well, for example, let's say the money that you get in a pidyon from Hegdesh, that money replaces the Hegdesh, and that's called chilufehem. The same law applies in the case of a konam. And this very much reminds us of the sugya of yesh me'ila b'konamos, that a konam is very similar to Hegdesh. And just like Hegdesh is asur, both begufo and bechilufo and begidulo, so too a konam is asur, not only begufo for these pairs themselves, but also b'chilufeim. If he took these peros and he sold them on the market, the money that he receives in payment for these peros is also aser b'ano. Or gidulim, if he took these peros that were aser b'konam and he planted them, the gidulim, that which grows from that planting, is also included in the Isa. So what's Rami Bar Chama's suffix? We have a Mishnah clearly that says about konam, that a konam generates an Isa not just in the gufa peros that he prohibited himself, but even in the chilufim and the gidulim. Boy, Rami Bar Chama Omar, if he declares konam peros ha'elu al ploni, mal b'chilufei. What if he says that these peros should be also to my friend, not the case that we've been dealing with in the Mishnah in the next parak in Nedarim, where he says peros elu alai konam, but rather konam peros elu al chaveri. And the Gemara is not sure whether he has the power or the authority to create an Iser on Ploni, even as far as Chilufim is concerned. Now, we want to mention here that we're dealing with Isurim Derabanan. When we say that Isuri Hano, like Chometz B'Pesach or Shor Niskal, after Gmar Din, is also B'Chilufein, it means that because it's Asur B'Ano, the Rabbanu will not allow you to sell them in order to get the money so that you can benefit from the money instead of the Chometz, instead of the Shor Niskal. So the Rabbanan prohibited the chilufim, meaning the damim. And now we get to Rami Bar Chama. Rami Bar Chama says the following. It's one thing if I asered peros on myself, and now I want to go ahead and circumvent that iser of hanof and the peros by selling them, then the Rabbanan said it's also b'chilufim. But Rami Bar Chama wants to know, what about a case where you asked the peros on somebody else? Why should that person who didn't take the neder upon himself be included in this derabanan of chilufim? So basically, chilufim is synonymous with what we call tfisas damim. And basically, every case of chilufim or tfisas damim involves some sort of a violation. He says the following. This is the summary of the Ran here in the Masechet. He writes, Lo matzanu b'Torah, Iser atofes is damov, Ella, there are only two areas in halacha where the doraisa halacha of tofes is damov applies. It only kicks in avodah zarah and in shvius. But in all other isurei Torah, there's no iser that's nitfas in the damin. So therefore, if the mudar himself does a chalifim, then on a doraisa level for sure, the chalifim are mutarin. There's no iser of tfisas damim in the case of mudar anah, because it doesn't fit into the doraisa category of avodah zarah or shvius. However, there is such a thing as a knas d'Rabbanan. And the Rabbanan expanded the din of chilufim to include even other cases, other isurim, other than avodah zarah and shvius. Like, for example, we gave the case of chametz and shor niskal, We're going to apply that principle in the case of a konom, but only where you're worthy of the knas, because you went ahead and you sold that which was usher to you. The overall iser bazeshe hichlif saperos. Now, why is that? Why did the Rabbanan create such a knas? Because basically what he's doing is he is benefiting from the peros. What's he doing? He went ahead and he sold the peros. So now he wants to be a chote niskar and benefit from the sale, which was prohibited of these peros, and enjoy the damim that he received in payment for the peros. We're not going to allow him to do that because he was nene from the Easter nether when he sold it on the open market in order to get its value. So let's analyze Rami Bar Chome's suffix. Mi Amrinan, should we say that the reason why the Rabbanon prohibited Chilufim and Gidulim is because the Noder established an Iser on this object in such a way that the Iser bichal even for Chilufim and Gidulim. But that's only legabi delay. That's only when he took an Iser upon himself. Because when he takes an Iser on himself, there's only one chidush over here. The chidush is that he asers not only the peros, but also the Chilufim and Gidulim. So that's called legabi delay in the language of the Gemara. Now, Chilufim and Gidulim are basically objects that are not in his possession. But yet, he has the authority and the power to prohibit that which is not in his possession on himself. That's called in the language of the Shas, Holvi Adam Oser Peres Chaver Alatzmo, Adam Oser Gam Davar Shelo Boliolam. In other words, Chilufim and Gidulim, it's not the original object, and it's like something that doesn't belong to him, because what belongs to him is the peros, the gufa peros, not the Chilufim and Gidulim. The Chilufim and Gidulim don't exist at this point. But since a person could generate an Iser on his friend's peros, vis-a-vis himself, that is like a davar shelo boliolam. And therefore, Chilufim and Gidulim, which, as we said before, is like a davar shelo boliolam, it's something brand new, it's not the original peros, well, he can aser it on himself. Because that's no different than asering peres chaver al atzmo, which is also like a davar shelo boliolam. But now we get to Rami Bar Chome's suffix, legabe chavero, if he wants to take his peros and prohibit them on his chaver, now there are two strikes against him. Hoil v'ein adam oser peres chavero al chavero. If you're talking about something that doesn't exist, like Chilufim and Gidulim, then that's like prohibiting on his friend's own peros. It's not his, and it's not even in the reshus of his friend. Is therefore ein adam oser davar shelo boliolam al chavero. If he wants to aser davar shelo boliolam, namely gidulim and chiluf on himself, that's okay. Why? Because even though it's like peros of chavero insofar as the davar shelo boliolam, he can aser peros chavero latzmo. But a person cannot prohibit a davar shelo boliolam on chavero, so he doesn't have the power and the authority to prohibit these peros al chavero with regard to Gidulim and Chilufim. Because peros that don't exist, number one, are like peros shel chavero, and he can't asa peros shel chavero al chavero. And number two, even as far as himself is concerned, there was a stretch because with the davar shelo boliolam, because Chilufim and Gidulim don't exist in the world. So it's like a tarti l'reusa here, because there are two strikes against him. It's a davar shelo bali olam, and it's like peros chavero al chavero. Why? Because since the chiluf and gidul don't exist, it's eino the most davar shelo bali olam. It's like other eino the most davar sheina shelo, and here it's like eino shelo. So if it's eino shelo, it's like he's answering peros of chavero al chavero. He says here in the footnote, Yochel Adam Lesar bin Neder al Atzmo afilu davar sheina shelo. That's okay. Why? Mishum sheyesh kan chisaron echad shachefetz haneser eina shelo. There's only one strike against it. Aval mi'idach yesh maila achas sha'adam oser olav hu birshuso lesar olav. He has complete control and authority over himself. Now, Adam oser al chaver davar shelo, because he has authority over his peros to ask them even on his friend. Shafal pi sheyesh chisaron shechavero eina b'rshusam v'kol makom yesh maila shachefetz hu shelo. V'yesh koach biyado lesar al chavero. But b'mokum sheish tarti l'reisa shegam hachefetz hanesar eino shelo, right? Because the davar shelo bali olam, and it's not in his rishus because it doesn't exist. To answer it on his friend, that's already tarti l'reisa. It's not his, and it's not b'rshusam. Now we start off Mem Zayin in base. We know clearly what the svara of Rami Bar Chama is, that a person cannot aser onto his friend chilufim and gidulim. What we don't know was the tzad that yes, he could achieve such a neder that would aser this chayfetz even with regard to chilufim ugidulim. And that's what we see here on Daf Mem Zayin base. So Dilma, perhaps the reason why gidulim are asurim is not because of this whole structure and this whole logical progression that he didn't have kavana to prohibit even the chilufim on his friend. Mishum de chilufim kegidulim domi. At this point, Rami Bar Chama gets into the gzeira of the Chachamim. He wants to understand why did the Chacham prohibit chilufim of Isuri Ana other than Avodah Zarah and Shara Niska. And the answer is that chilufim kigidulim. In the case of gidulim, what you have is something that in a sense is a, what's the word I want to use here? It's an extension of the original object. I need a word here. You know the concept called Bino Kari Davua Ninhu. In other words, the son is born from the flesh and blood of his father. He's an extension of his father. That's called Gidulim. And the Rabbanan now take Gidulim, where you have the original peri, and now it's growing something after you take out the zera and plant it. And we're going to apply that, clone that onto chilufim. That even in the case of chilufim, let's say, for example, he sells it on the market, he gets damim for it, that also is, in a sense, an extension like gidulim. And the Rabbanan are going to say that we're going to impose a gzera on chilufim in Isuri Hana, just like gidulim of Isuri Hana are asurim. And he says here in the name of the Rosh that Gidulim hayapashut l'Rami bar Chama she'asu lehenos mihem. That the Isur Hano extends to Gidulim when you replanted. That was pashut to Rami bar Chama. His whole suffix, says the Rosh, was about chilufim. He vacillated about chilufim. Says the Rosh, that's why the Gemara uses the term chilufim ki gidulim domim. That the Rabbanan made a gzera on chilufim of Isur Hano, just like gidulim of Isur Hano, and that was pashut were asurim. Oh, if that be the case, if now you're including gidulim and chilufim under one rubric of gzeras chachamim, and even the chilufim are like gidulim, and we said that gidulim was pashut, that it's also, is therefore loshna hu loshna chavero. It doesn't make any difference whether or not the neder is mikoach hu, meaning he asked it on himself, or chavero. If the neder was chal vis-a-vis chavero, then the mudar ana is also, again on a drabanan level based on this gzera, not only on gidulim, but also on chilufim, because chilufim have the same replacement or extension status as gidulim. Omar Rav Acha bar Yomi, Toshma, I want to bring a proof from a brisa. Ha'omer li'ishto konam shani nenelech, the Baal asks on his wife, Hana from him, and therefore she can't be supported by him. And now she's in straits. She needs money to support herself, but she can't take it from her husband because she's mudar Hana. Is lova, she's allowed to go out into the market and borrow money in order to support herself and buy mizonos. They can come back now and collect their loan, that debt from the Baal himself. So again, even though she's asur la'anos me'baila, but nevertheless, he still, the husband, has a shibud, he has a monetary commitment and obligation to support him. Now, her lender, her malva, could come back to the Baal and collect for the loan that they extended to her. So she's not benefiting from the Baal because now the debt is between the Baal and the malva. My timer. Why does the Bryce allow this? Balichovim vinifroim. Those who lent her money, extended a loan, they can collect from the Baal. So the most that she's receiving from the Malva are really chilufim. Why are they chilufim? Because they're replacing the most that the Baal really owed her in the context of ksuba for mizonos. So when she borrows money, she's really tying up the most of her husband, who's going to have to pay back these loans, as a replacement for the alva. So the alva that she receives is really, in effect, the domim of the Baal. Just that it's going like Shibud the Rab Nosson, it's going from the Baal to the Malvim and from the Malvim to the Isha. And that's called Chilufim. Now, if Rami Bar Chama had tzad to say the Chilufim are like Gidulim, that just like when you planted, that which is produced, the Tzemach, is an extension of the original, so too that which is replacing Domim, that replacing in Chilufim are also like Gidulim, then how can we allow this woman to receive a loan from Sofa? And that person who extends that loan is going to collect his debt from the Baal, because now basically it's a Chilufim situation in which the money that she's receiving is a chilufim for the money that the Baal will pay the Malveh, and therefore she's benefiting from the Baal. How could this be permissible if chilufim is also? Lav, isn't it therefore so that we have to draw the conclusion that gidulim is an extension of the original object because it's being planted and producing, but not so in the case of chilufim, so that when a person imposes a neder on his wife, the chilufim are not asurim al ishto, and therefore we should apply that by analogy, the same principle, to the case of someone who said peros elu al ploni. He asks his peros onto ploni, and the chilufim are not asurim. Omar Rava, no, he rejects it. Dilma, perhaps. Lechatchila. Now, what does the word lechatchila here mean? The Ran says lechatchila here means biyadayim. What does that mean, biyadayim? The mudar comes with his own hands, with Isurei Hana, and he wants to sell them on the open market and get their domin. That's called chilufim. Hudalo, that would not be mutar. And if he went and he violated this, the Rabbanu would say he's not allowed to benefit from the chilufim, but he avad. What is the avad? Let's say that it wasn't a direct chilufim. For example, the case of the wife, she didn't take his money directly from his bank account. She only got it indirectly, not biyadayim, not lechatchila. But rather she took money from the malva, and now the Baal has to pay back that money to the malva. So that's not called chalipin mamish. It's not a direct chalipin. He writes here, "Kagon isha zu shebeshoshe kiblas alva dayin lo hayumos chalipin shel nechsei Baal." Where the most that the Baal is going to pay back to the malva? Are they in a certain bank account? Is there a check? Is it really chalipin? Right now, it's not chalipin. Li'achar mikan, later on, when the Baal is going to reimburse the malva, at that point, the most that she received from the malva become chalipin. But the Rabbanan didn't answer it, says Rava, in that kind of scenario, where she already has the most, and then they become chalipin. It's when she takes the object that's osur, that's mudar anamim, and when she sells it and converts it into damim, that's called chalipin lechatchila, and that's biyadayim. So at this point, Rava shoots down the proof of Rabbi Yacha bar Yomi, and we're left hanging in the balance as to whether chalifin are gidulim, have the same status as gidulim and kilun and exero, and they're not. Elatoshma, but why don't we derive from the Mishnah Kiddushin Nunvav? Hamakadesh isha be'orla, a man gives a woman peres orla, eina mekudeshes. Why? There's no din mamon to peres orla, it's asur b'ana. So it can't have the status of kesef Kiddushin. But mecharan, if the Makadesh who wants to marry this woman sells peres orla, which he wasn't allowed to do, the Kidesh b'dmeim, and he took the monies that he received by selling orla and gave it for Kiddushin, harei zu mekudeshes. Now wait a second. This is chilufei Isurei Hana. She is selling peros orla on the open market. Well, actually, let me just make one change. It wasn't she who sold it; it was he who sold it. But again, it doesn't matter. This is chalipei Isurei Hana. So how can it say in the Mishnah harei zu mekudeshes if we assume that in Isuri Anah, Chalipin have the same status as Gidulim, and therefore it's also Ba'anah, so here there's a Ran. Now, honestly, I have trouble with this Ran. Maybe you could help me with it. The Ran seems to reduce this whole sugya to the following issue. Does he have to marry her again? Does he need a new kiddushin? Now, why does the Ran think that he needs a new kiddushin? So I thought that the pashtus here would be because if the Rabbanan prohibited chilufin, then the chilufin had the same status as the original Isur Hana, namely the Paris of Arla. And just like Paris of Arla, B'toras Isur Hana is not Mammon, he didn't give her anything. He didn't give her a Shava Kesef, so the same thing should apply to chilufin. But for some reason, the Ran says something entirely different. He says that the reason why he needs a new kiddushin is because she herself has a status of chilufin. She herself is like replacing the Arla of Isuri Anah. She is, so to speak, being makna herself for Arla. So like when you take Arla and you sell it on the open market, then the damim that you receive is chilufim of the Arla. In this case, instead of selling the Arla on the open market, he bought a woman. He was Makadish and Isha, and he was Konaha. And he was Konaha b'Peiros Arla. That gives her the status of chilufim of Peiros Arla. And if Chalipin have the same dinas as the original, then this would be a case of an Isur. And he'd have to be Makadisher again. And yet it says here, Reizu Mekudeshes. So if it's a Reizu Mekudeshes, apparently the Chalipin does not have the same status as the original Isur Hanah. And that's what he says here, the Ran, Muchach Mikan, Shechalipin Mutarim Lamachlif. So the Gemara says, no, I'm going to reject this for the same reason that I rejected it in the name of Rava when we discussed the brisa of a woman who's mudar anah from her husband and she borrows money from the malveh in order to support herself. L'chatchila hu delo, but v'avad avid. So the chalipin are asur, and the rabbanan asidit, but that's a case of l'chatchila. However, this case is not a case of l'chatchila. Why? What happened here? It says here, Mokron v'kidesh b'dmeya. He, the Makadish, actually sold the Peiros of Arla on the open market, took the damim, and was Makadish and Isha with the damim. So you now have Chalipe Chalifin. If you want to talk about her, she is now Chalifin of Chalifin, because he sold the Peiros Arla on the open market, and that damim now has the din of the status of Chalife Isuri Anah, and now when he's Makadish and Isha, she becomes Chalipe Chalifin, and that the Gemara says he Ovid. You want to say that he cannot benefit from Peiros Arla, he can't benefit from Chalipe Peiros Arla, and he can't benefit from Chalipe Peiros Arla, and she has the status of Chalipe Chalifin, and therefore he has to be Mekadosh her again. Otherwise, he's being nene from the original Paris of Oral. No, that father Rabbanan didn't go. He says, "Im avar v'nena me'achalifin al yidei shehichlifam b'davar acher." He took the chalifin and he didn't benefit directly from the chalifin, but rather he was machlif the chalifin with the isha. Is then mutal lihenos. He's allowed to have hanon. Mishum sherakes hachalifin atzman asru chachamim, aval chalifei chalifin mutarim. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Mem Zayin Amud Beis. Hareni alecha cherem, and we said that cherem depends upon Anshe Yehuda and Anshe Golil. So let's say one of the Anshe Golil, where they had a lot of access to Hegdesh and to Berek Habayis, so he said Hareni alecha cherem, and he's from Anshe Golil. So the word cherem now means Berek Habayis, Cherem Berek Habayis, and he is prohibiting himself onto his chaver like Hegdesh. Is amudar also. However, if he says Harei at olai cherem, so at olai means that he is taking an iser anov from his friend onto himself, as if it was Hegdesh. Is anoder also. But if he says Hareni olecha ve'at olai, so he uses both lashonos. So alecha means he's prohibiting himself by hana onto his friend. At olai means he won't get hana from his friend. Ishneim asurim. Right? Neither one of them could have hana from the other one. Now, all this applies to the Anshe Golin. Ushnei mutarim b'davar shel olei bavel. Now we're going to see a whole list of things which the olei bavel all these things, they were mafkir them for the entire Klal Yisrael. They don't belong to anyone. No one could claim ownership on them. The Asurim b'davar shel osa'ir. So the Mishnah here on Daf Mem Ches continues, Ezu davar shel olei bavel kagon harabayis v'azoros v'abor shebemtza derech. All these are mutarim because there's no shutfis. It's really belongs to everybody. But again, I shouldn't say it belongs to everybody because that sounds identical to shutfis. But rather, there's this greater bailus that doesn't relate to any individual. It's like a concept like tzibur. It's above, beyond the individuals. So no one is being nenamich shel chaver. But in contrast, the Mishnah says, "Ezu davar shel osa'ir kigon archava merchas beis haknes v'ateva v'asfarim." All those are owned b'shutfis by the bnei ha'ir. They had an open area that was used for all communal functions. They had a beis hamerchatz that was communally owned. The beis haknes belongs to everyone. The teva where they put the Sefer Torah on, that belongs to everyone in the city, Asfarim, the Sifrei Torah, that they would read from. In all these cases, the Anshe Ha'ir, including every last member of the city population, owns a shutfis in those objects, in the Rechava, the Merchatz, Beis HaKnesset, the Teva, and the Sfarim. And therefore, there's going to be an Isa Neder, because each one is Nene now from every single one of the Anshe Ha'ir. B'dvarim elu shneim asurim. Kevan sheim shayochim l'chol Anshe Ha'ir v'chol echa Nene mishal chavero. So this is where we're going to stop for today, even though we're in the middle of a Mishnah, but it's a very long Mishnah. And we're up to Hakosev here on Daf Mem Ches Amud Aleph. Okay then, so thank you so much. And we'll find out what your availability is for tomorrow.